Okay, so welcome along, ladies and gentlemen, to your weekly SETI seminar series. Tonight we're very fortunate to be joined by Ed Larson, who's come to us from Stanford University, his new home. In fact, he was just teaching classes just then. Ed has a BA from Williams College and a JD from Harvard, and he got his PhD and MA from the University of Wisconsin. He was just recently the university professor of history at Pepperdine University and now moved to the Bay Area into Stanford. Ed was won the Pulitzer Prize in history writing for his book Summer of the Gods on the Scopes trial in 1998. He's also written extensively on American history topics such as the election of 1800, and he has appeared on The Daily Show and also extensively on C-SPAN, where I regularly see him. And he won the National Civil Liberties Award from the ACLU as well. Tonight he's going to talk to us about his latest book, which is called An Empire of Ice. So if you'll join me in welcoming Ed.
Thank you. Well, in part I'm going to talk about this book. I'm going to talk about a little part of the book. But I wanted to start by putting a picture I took at the South Pole up, because if you see this date, January 17, 1912, you will notice that that is 100 years ago tomorrow. Yesterday, 100 years ago yesterday, yes. 100 years ago yesterday. Well, I knew it was one day off. Actually, it was 100 years ago last month is the other date for Roald Amundsen. That's when, 100 years ago in December, when a 5-person team led by the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen became the first person to ever reach the South Pole. Now, I do have a picture of him here. I think this is the way I go. There he is. And I picked this particular picture because this is how he envisioned himself, or at least how he wanted others to envision him, because this is what he chose for the frontispiece of his book, The South Pole, recounting his tales of getting to the South Pole. You see him there in Inuit garb, which he wore. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Antarctica, but there are no Inuits in Antarctica, nor are there any polar bears. If there were, there wouldn't be any penguins. But he had earlier been the first to traverse the Northwest Passage, now something that apparently people can do in their yachts today because of global warming. But at the time had never been done by anyone when he did it about 110 years ago. And that took him 3 years, 2 winters. He was frozen in 2 winters to make it through. And during that time, he had plenty of time to learn about Inuits intimately, including how they dressed and their clothing, which he then made great use of when he went to the South Pole. Now, it is 100 years ago this week, just to be safe, that a similarly sized British band under the command of this man reached the same place, only to find the Norwegians had gotten there first. Now I picked this picture because this is how he envisioned himself. This is how he put on himself. You can now see why he lost. This is how he put himself on the frontispiece of his book about his first expedition to Antarctica, the Discovery Expedition. This is his frontispiece from that book. The losers, this group, the British group, the losers in this supposed race to the pole, never returned. And over time, in countless retellings, their story, the story of Scott and his group, became an epic tale of adventure, of competition, of triumph, and of tragedy in a frozen land. Well, given the the drama of the British death march, their march back, their death march back, and the remarkable efficiency of the Norwegian effort, and the worldwide attention that was focused on this supposed race between the two parties, I'm not surprised that historians and popularizers alike, when they write about this, and there are countless books about it, I have a bookcase full of them myself, they focus on the narrative of these entire expeditions on the race to the pole. Now, but I'm a historian of science. I love adventure. I love those stories, but I'm a historian of science, and I'm drawn to science. And that's where I tell the story different, where I see this story very, very differently. Researchers on Scott's, scientific researchers, scientists, some of the best, some excellent scientists, some members of the Royal Society, on Scott's 2 Antarctic expedition, and there were 2, not 1. Everybody only thinks of the 1, and an intervening one led by another British explorer, Ernst Shackleton, 3 expeditions to Antarctica, opened an unknown continent to science. They enriched our understanding of global meteorological, biological, and oceanographical systems. They basically discovered global ecology. It's together these 3 expeditions, each of which went to Antarctica with over 20 men and wintered over on Antarctica's Ross Island. They proved that the southern continents were once linked and returned with clear evidence of global climate change. To me, not only are these stories of doing science in extreme conditions at least as gripping as those of getting to the pole, they're part of a more significant narrative, a narrative you people care about because this institute that's committed to science, it's looking at new frontiers here. Well, that's what they were looking at. Antarctica was an unknown place. When the first expedition went down, they did not even know if there was a continent in Antarctica or simply an archipelago of islands like on the north and a little ice cap. By the time they got done, they had a pretty good idea what Antarctica was all about that's very similar to our idea. They created our vision of Antarctica. And that's, because they were fundamental in that, that's, to me, a more important story than a mere dash to the pole. Further, by looking at that broader story, which is what my book does, on all 3 expeditions, Scott's and Shackleton's, and another smaller British expedition, and a German expedition, and a Swedish expedition that went down about that time. They help to explain why Scott trailed so far behind Amundsen despite having more men and more resources. Now, giving credit to science of Scott's expedition takes nothing away from Amundsen's achievement, and I don't mean to do that. I'm of Scandinavian descent myself, and I'm an admirer of Amundsen. Only the Norwegian reached the pole and returned safely, and he did so over an unknown route in less than 100 days with food to spare. Further, the pursuit of science does not excuse Scott for poor choices that, combined with forgivable misfortune, contributed to suffering and death on the polar journey. But it does provide perspective and give meaning for the British endeavor. And rather than go through my whole book, which goes through all these expeditions and unpacks, which no one has ever done before, the science work on these expeditions, nobody has ever looked at them as a whole in this respect. What I want to do tonight, since I only have you for like an hour or 45 minutes, I'm going to, and because we are at the anniversary of Scott reaching the pole and Amundsen, what I'm going to do to sort of make my point about how different the British expeditions were, I'm going to just, instead of dealing with all 3 of them, which cover a 12-year period, I'm just going to go back 6 months, half a year prior to Amundsen's arrival at the pole, and then sort of compare the accounts of Amundsen's expedition with Scott's expedition. That'll fit in the time frame. It'll give you a feel for what was happening. So that means we start our story in June of 1911. At that time, Amundsen and Scott were at their respective winter quarters, which were some 400 miles apart on opposite ends of Ross Ice Shelf sea edge. Is it okay if I walk over and point it out? Let me give you some orientation on the map. That's the south. The South Pole is right up at the top. So we're coming down from New Zealand in the case. This is the Great Southern Ocean, below the Pacific Ocean. And there's a sea, which had been discovered earlier by Captain Ross, the Ross Sea, which is frozen over in winter, which would be in June it would be frozen over, their winter, but it opens up in the summer, and the sea ice drifts forward and it creates a pack that's sort of broken pack that you have to sail through. Then you get into this open sea. Now when you get in there, there's this bay heading in. This is mountains, South Victoria Land, mountains. The boundary goes, this is as they knew it, they didn't know this part of it, and comes back around here. So you get this bay. This part is frozen solid permanently with glacial ice coming down from the Antarctic Plateau, which is behind these mountains, 9,000 feet high, coming down through the various passes and then forming an ice shelf that floats on the water but is hundreds of feet thick, coming out here. And this is the sea edge of it. It periodically breaks off and it gets those beautiful, amazing tabular icebergs, some the size of Rhode Island or Delaware, that break off in pieces. Now, there's an island that sticks out of this ice edge, the barrier's edge. Eventually, if this moves back, the island will be entirely free. But right now, it's frozen, and it was then. Permanent ice behind it, glacial ice, freshwater ice. It's sticking out in the end. This is where the British camped along here. All three British expeditions camped here. Here's the mainland where they went over and explored the mountains. Amundsen docked at a bay, a natural bay, in the ice barrier itself and put his camp on the ice. And he was going to go up this route, and Scott was this route. So that's where they were in June, middle of winter, dead winter, June 1911. The sun had set on both camps in April, and it wouldn't come up again until September. Amundsen and his men remained in camp throughout the entire winter, devoting their time solely to preparing themselves and their equipment for the trip ahead. No research, no other activities, just preparing themselves and their equipment for the trip. They set off first for the pole in October 19th, and from that point on, with 4 sledges, and beginning with 52 dogs pulling those sledges, and the others either riding on the sledges or skiing, 5 people in all. It was a dash across the Ross Ice Shelf, up the Axel Hallberg Glacier to the polar plateau, and then over the polar plateau, 9,000 feet high, to the pole itself, arriving on December 14th. The Norwegians saw no sign of Scott when they got there. They camped for 4 days and used every available means to confirm their position, as shown in this picture of them, trying to make sure they were right at the pole. They did that for 4 days, and then after scanning the horizon one more time for Scott, on December 17, the Norwegians started for home. They left behind a small tent with some XX provisions and a note for Scott, who they assumed would arrive shortly. And there is their tent that they left, their Norwegian flag, and 4 of the 5 Norwegians. Somebody has to take the picture. So Amundsen is at the furthest away from the tent, is Amundsen. Now, the first sentence of Amundsen's report account of his trip back from the pole reads, "The going was splendid, and all were in good spirits. So we went along at a great pace." That's pretty typical of the writing of the whole book. Not very death-defying, not very adventuresome. It gets rather tedious because the weather is always pretty good, and they're always going along at a pretty great pace. On the way back, much of the route was downhill, of course. Improvised sails were hoisted on the sleds. The sleds went so fast at times that the skiers struggled to keep up. Rations steadily increased for men and dogs as they passed their evenly spaced supply depots which they had left on their way out. Some food, they had so much that some food was left behind. The polar party reached its ship in good health and high spirits on January 25, 1912, after 99 days out and back. Amundsen had gained weight. Now, the story is, of course, quite different for Scott and his men. First, let me go back. 6 months before Amundsen reaching the pole, in June. We're in June, and carry it forward. There's a lot more to tell on this one. First, not all of the men were even wintering together at the same place on Ross Island. 6 of the men, including the expedition's third in command, Victor Campbell, and the experienced Antarctic geologist Raymond Priestley, who was a veteran and survivor of Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, they had been dispatched from the main base to winter over, not with the rest of the men in a cabin that they'd built there, but over on the mainland. Here's their picture. At the cabin on the mainland. Now, just to show you where they are, I'll just go back very quickly and then come back forward. They've been repositioned by the ship before winter set out here at Cape Adair to do biological and geological research here, look for fossils, study the mountains. And then after the winter was, and so they could contribute nothing to preparing Scott for the pole. And then after the winter was over, rather than be brought back and be supporters for Scott's, because what Scott was doing was he was spending the first winter, get down there in winter over, and then in the next spring head to the pole, because you don't have time to get in and go the same year. So after the sun comes back up in the spring, he's going to head off. When he brings these people back, rather than come back here and be supporters for what he's doing, these are scientists. He repositions them at a place called Terra Nova Bay on the coast here, where they could, very geologically and glaciologically interesting place. It's where the Italians now have their permanent base. It's where 3 glaciers come together down off of the polar plateau and meet. And so it's an ideal place to do geological and glaciological research. It's no place to help Scott, because it's nowhere near where Scott is. Now, and they were planned to be there for the summer, for a month of midsummer research, and then be brought back to the main base, which is about the time Scott was supposed to get back, and then head out. But the real adventure for them, just to show what they were going through, these scientific teams, the real adventure began for them when they get trapped over there. Because when the ship comes to pick them up after the month of geological research, the ship is blocked by the pack ice and can't get to them. Well, by this time, it's too late for them to hike out, because hiking out would mean they would have to go all the way around and back to the base, and nobody's ever traveled in the middle of winter before in Antarctica. They know they have to hunker down and spend the next winter there and hope to get out the following winter. Well, that's where the real adventure began, and it shows, and I'm going to tell the story briefly, to show just how much of Scott's expedition's precious resources and best men were devoted to activities wholly unrelated to the pole. Now, Terra Nova Bay, as I noted already, is a fine place for a month of geological research in the summer. I've spent a week there, and it's a brilliant place if you like paleontology and rocks. But in the winter, without a prefab building, after the ship had been blocked from the pack to retrieve them, and the temperatures plunged far below zero, it became an awful place to live. Yet, they were going to have to live there. During virtually the entire winter, fierce winds blow down those glaciers from the polar plateau, sweeping across the glaciers and then into the bay. The men could not survive in their summer tents. They would have been blown to pieces. And they had brought only enough food and fuel for their planned month stay, and clothing for their month stay. As Priestley wrote in his diary at this time, "It is evident that 3 things are absolutely necessary. We must have light, shelter, and hot food." Well, looking first for shelter, Campbell and Priestley found a large drift of packed snow on a boulder-strewn coastal ridge that they affectionately named Inexpressible Island. As Priestley wrote, "We first sank a trench 3 feet by 4 feet to a depth of 6 feet, and then from the side of this we picked out a large cave toward the thickest part of the drift. When finished, the cave, 12 feet wide by 9 feet long and not quite tall enough for a man to stand, became this party's winter quarters." You can see a picture of it there. Now, as Campbell wrote, "Our roof is hard snow about 3 feet thick, while the walls and floors are ice. The men heated and cooked with a jury-rigged tin stove, really an old tin bucket, that they burned seal blubber." Of course, they'd run out of their fuel, so they were going to have to heat themselves with, there are no trees down there. Seal blubber was it. And burning this seal blubber inside their cave caked everything inside the cave, including the men themselves, with greasy black soot. Light came from burning shoestrings in a blubber lamp. To prevent the ceiling from melting, they kept the inside temperature below freezing, and while not doing their chores, spent day and night, except it was always dark, so it was always effectively night, in their threadbare sleeping bags. With shelter and light found, such as it was, food became their preoccupation. Now Campbell tasked Priestley, and here we see him in his ice cave, to ration the stores. From the scant remaining supplies, he set aside the barest minimums for the anticipated spring trip back to main base, because they knew their ship wasn't coming. They were going to have to walk back to main base once it became light the next spring. And then he divided the remaining food by the rest of the time ahead. Now this allocation, of course, they weren't planning to spend a winter, so they didn't have much left. This allocation left each person with only a biscuit and a mug of weak cocoa or tea per day, 12 lumps of sugar and 2 ounces of chocolate every week, and 25 raisins each month. That's it. Beyond these rations, the men lived on what they killed, which meant every seal and penguin that wandered their way that winter. There were never enough. Seal became the staple, with the meat and organs cooked into a stew they called hoosh, and the blubber fried, eaten raw, or used for fuel. Everyone found seal meat so insipidly bland that the cooks made the hoosh with seawater for added salt and raided the medicine kit for flavoring, with mixed results. Now, I know you live in a culinary delight of San Francisco, and many of you like to eat. Let me give you one little tip. I could give you many more from the diaries that I've read of these men. Hoosh, or stew, cooked with a mustard plaster, which they hoped would taste like mustard, actually tastes more like linseed oil. But as Priestley noted in his diary, quote, "Even this was a change from undiluted seal." Biscuits ended in August. Sugar and chocolate ended in September. But seal hoosh continued even after a tainted batch caused food poisoning. Dysentery became endemic, which, as Campbell observed, as in his own words from his diary, is most inconvenient in this weather when to be out in the wind for a few seconds means frostbite. And you can imagine where that frostbite was. We're talking about dysentery. The meat-only diet also caused a lack of bladder control. Some of us, Campbell wrote, some of us have been wetting our clothes in our sleep. One of us even while he was awake before he could get out the door. And these are the clothes that we have to live in for 8 months. They didn't have a change of clothes. It was a summer trip, except the ones they were going to use going back. Here's what they look like after the light came back out, when they came out of their cave. Somehow the party survived the winter, and in spring man-hauled 2 sledges over 2 deeply crevassed ice tongues and 200 miles of often disturbed sea ice to the expedition's main base. The trip took 38 days in total. They frequently floundered in new spring snow up to the sockets of their thighs, and the sledges regularly capsized on slopes. Nevertheless, and this tells you why they were there and what they were about. Nevertheless, on the whole way back, Priestley gathered rock specimens and fossils and put them on the sledges that they were pulling. These specimens included plant fossils that offered important evidence that the Antarctic was once warm enough to sustain a rich flora, which nobody knew before. Field researchers on Scott's Royal Society-backed Discovery Expedition of 1901, the first one, and the Royal Society geologists who went along with Shackleton's Nimrod expedition of 1907, had been the first to find such evidence of historic climate change in the Antarctic. From their observations of glacial deposits and ice-free valleys, they had surmised that the Antarctic climate was now warming once again, a hypothesis that glacial research by Priestley's party, this group, further confirmed. Its winter ordeal, however, became the party's greatest legacy. It returned with a tale of endurance in ice, unsurpassed in the annals of British polar exploration, all done in the name of science. Here's what they looked like after they'd shaved when they got back. That's the sledge they pulled behind them. They had started with two, but one finally broke down altogether. Now, that's sort of the distraction. That's what the science was going on. I think that's much more stirring than trying to get to a pole. Now, these exploits that I just told you about, I could have picked a dozen other things that were happening during that winter before Scott was off trying to go to a pole. I picked this one. Let me give you one more. Because it was an example. The other one I'm going to pick out was even more significant a diversion from Scott's polar expedition because it involved two of the 5 men that went with Scott to the pole and died on the return journey. They're the scientist and researcher Edward Wilson, shown here, and H.R. Bertie Bowers, who I'll show later. These 2 men, 6 months ago, if I go back 6 months before Amundsen reached the pole, in June of 1911, these 2 men, Wilson and Bowers, who would be with Scott, were not even preparing for the polar journey or in helping others to prepare. They instead were on a death-defying midwinter scientific research trip of their own. And this effort exemplifies the extreme lengths to which Scott's expedition went to for science. Now, at the time, to put it in context, the other trip was for geology and glaciology, which you can understand. At the time, the great British ornithologist P.L. Slater, probably the greatest ornithologist of the day, had hypothesized that penguins were the oldest surviving type of bird in the world, and that emperors in particular were the oldest, most ancient species of penguin. During the earlier expedition, Scott's first expedition, which Wilson was also along on, Scott's team had been the first ever to discover an emperor penguin rookery. That had never been, they'd seen a few emperor penguins, but nobody knew how they bred or their life cycle or anything about them. And Wilson, who was Slater's man on the expedition, Slater had handpicked Wilson to be his sort of eyes and ears in Antarctica looking at these penguins, had determined, the first ever person to determine this, and he wrote a monograph when he got back, had determined that these remarkable birds laid and hatched their eggs in midwinter. No other type of bird was known to do that. No other type of penguin does that. We all know it because we watch those Disney movies, but they didn't know it. Wilson discovered it. It fascinated the world, what he discovered about these penguins. And now, if he went back with Scott, if I come back on your next expedition, I want to go to those penguins at the most interesting time. I want to go watch them breed. I want to go watch them hatch and raise their eggs. And that means I want to go there in the middle of winter. Well, at the time, no one had ever tried to go out in the Antarctic winter. They had gone down there and stayed in bases preparing and then headed out. Even the party I was talking about earlier had stayed in camps both winters. Wilson wanted to lead a group to the penguin rookery so that he could study the penguins on site. In particular, what he wanted to study was in line with then current evolutionary theory. Wilson wanted to see if the youngest embryos of this supposed oldest avian species displayed vestiges of reptilian teeth. If Wilson could find evidence in penguin embryos linking two classes of animals, reptiles and birds, then he could confirm the hypothesis of Slater and T.H. Huxley, who'd been behind the first expedition, the first discovery expedition, that birds had descended from reptiles and therefore further proved the theory of evolution. Well, that means you have to go there when they have embryos, when they have laid their eggs. And nobody had ever done that. Well, to reach the rookery in midwinter, Wilson, Bowers, and assistant geologist Apsley Cherry Gerard left winter quarters at Cape Evans in June, 6 months before the reaching the pole, in June for the 70-mile trek to Cape Crozier in the middle of winter, with scientific equipment, cold weather gear, and supplies loaded on 2 9-foot sledges linked end to end and to the men by harnesses. The men hauled over 750 pounds. They didn't use dogs. The British didn't use dogs. They pulled themselves. Here's what they look like just when they're leaving. Here's their cabin that they're all wintering in. It's pitch dark, of course, because it's always pitch dark in June in Antarctica. And here they are lit up with flood lamps. You can see the sledges behind them, the all of one and part of another. You can see their sledging harnesses. They're going to be pulling those sledges through the winter, night darkness, total darkness, 70 miles to get to Cape Crozier. Now, the outward bound journey went about as well as you'd expect. The men, I'll show a map of their route. We're starting up over here. This is the open water in the summer. Of course, it's frozen over in winter. Sea ice. Cape Evans, where their camp is. This is the island. This is the glacial land ice, that, the Great Barrier, the Ross Ice Shelf, that pushes up against this island. So it pushes on this side, and then this is it on the sea edge of it. So they have to go around over to the rookery, which is at the other end of the island. You couldn't go over the island. This is Mount Erebus. This is 13,000 feet high. They're going to go around the backside. That's their plan in the middle of winter, when nobody has ever traveled in the Antarctic winter before. As you can see, they traveled south to Cape Armitage, and then from there up onto the Ross Ice Shelf, and there it got cold. Colder than it had ever been previously recorded anywhere in the history of the world to that time. As they reached the southern side of Ross Island and went from Cape Armitage to Cape Crozier, below minus 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, when snow gets that cold, it turns into like granular. So you've got sledges with runners. They're supposed to slide over the ice or over the snow. But if the snow becomes granular, it becomes like sand. And what happens to a 750-pound sledge with runners on a sandy beach? It sinks into the sand, and so you're pulling the sledge through the sand. Because of that, they couldn't haul both at the same time when they got down there. They had to relay. They'd pull one, and then they'd leave it and go back and get the other one, and then pull it, which meant 1 mile gain for 3 miles walked, which extended their trip. Finally, as they pulled their way across there, finally on June 15th, nearly 3 weeks after they began, the men climbed out onto a wind-swept rocky moraine overlooking Cape Crozier. Somewhere on the sea ice, about 4 miles to the east, shrouded in darkness, lay the rookery. They'd been there in the spring in the earlier trip. They'd been there in the fall in the earlier trip to study the penguins. They'd never been there in winter in total darkness. Now, think, well, they made it. Well, yeah, they hadn't quite made it. Before trying to reach it, the men built a stone hut on the moraine where they planned to live and work while studying the emperors. Now, why would they do this? because they were trying to study the embryos to see little details, like if they had reptilian teeth in the embryos, or whether the papulas that are going to create the feathers are similar to a reptile's bumps that become scales. They want to look for evolutionary similarities. Well, you can't do that if the embryo freezes, because you lose that detail. So they're going to go down and get the eggs and keep them warm without freezing and come back. They have to have a place where they can dissect them. That's why they had to take so much weight. They had taken microscopes and other equipment to do research on these embryos to prove the theory of evolution. That's the effort they were going to prove, not to get to the South Pole, to prove the theory of evolution. So they needed a warm place. It took 3 days to complete the project. Using a sledge as a ceiling beam and stretching canvas over the top of 4 rock walls, they caulked the cracks on the rocks with snow and assembled a blubber snow for heat. To protect it from the storm sweeping down off the mountains, which are above them, they built the hut into the lee side of the moraine just below the ridge. Well, with the hut up and in need of blubber for fuel and eggs for research, they headed off for the penguins. Now, here is what it's going to look like. They couldn't take a picture because it was pitch dark, but Wilson was a drawer, and so he drew the rookery. And you can see in the background the cliffs where they're going to be located, and the rookery down on the sea ice. Now, by this time, they had planned their trip. By this time, there was a midday twilight. The sun still didn't come up, but it was twilight for a couple hours, 4 hours in the middle of each day. And so they tried to use that light to pick their way down from above, from the land, down onto the sea ice and find the rookery. The first time they tried to do that, the first day, they dropped onto the sea ice beyond the first pressure ridge and spent 5 hours wandering in a labyrinth of 60-foot high hummocks of ice before retreating at dusk. They could hear the penguins, but they could hear them through the ice, but they were blocked by these walls of ice as they were walking through, because what it is the glacier comes in off the sea and hits this island, and so it bumps up with all these ridges. So the second time, the next day, they made a steeper descent into a narrow gorge between the first pressure ridge and the land ice cliff, which they followed to the rookery. They encountered obstacles as they went, where debris was pushed in from the sea ice to block their way or had fallen from the cliff. But they either crawled through holes in the ice or cut steps over it, and finally they reached the rookery just before total darkness. Then the explorers faced a dilemma. As Cherry Gerard wrote in his account, and it captures the scientific element, so I'll read it. After Cherry Gerard, he wrote, "After indescribable effort and hardship, we were witnessing a marvel of the natural world. We had within our grasp material which might prove of utmost importance to science. We were turning theories into facts with every observation we made. But we only had moments to give. The party had not carried supplies to stay out on the ice, nor could they get back in total darkness. So they decided they quickly skinned 3 penguins for blubber and grabbed 6 eggs and bolted for the hut with the expectation of returning later for more serious research." Here are the 3 of the 6 eggs that made it. They're now in the British Museum. Unfortunately for the men, the weather deteriorated in overnight and threatened to become much worse. By situating their hut just below the ridge, Wilson had hoped to protect them from wind coming down from the mountains. But instead, he didn't know which way the wind was going to be coming from in a gale. The wind was actually coming off the ice barrier, off the Ross ice shelf, and going up, which meant he put it right in the path of the powerful updrafts going up. The storm's first gusts ballooned the canvas roof up and sucked in snow from every crack. The men piled slabs of ice on the roof during lulls in the storms, but it made little difference. The brunt of the storm hit the following night with gale-force winds, causing the hut's roof to rise and fall with increasing violence. until finally, on the third day, it exploded outward in shreds, leaving the men cowering in their sleeping bags under drifting snow and rubble from the roof and the walls. It was Wilson's 39th birthday. 70 miles from winter quarters without shelter, Cherry Gerard lost all hope and began thinking of taking morphine to ease the end. The storm subsided a day later, however, and they headed back to the main base. The eggs they had collected had all been lost or frozen, making them useless for embryo research. But there was no possibility now, with the wreck of their hut and the loss of so much of their stuff, to do any further work. Well, the return trip was a living hell. The exhausted party first had to recross the pressure ridges and crevassed ice around Cape Crozier, then pass over the frigid ice shelf to Cape Armitage before turning north on the sea ice to winter quarters. With only 4 hours of dim twilight and up to 16 hours of darkness every day, 16 hours of sledging they had to do every day, most of their trip was done still in total darkness. As Wilson wrote, "We traveled as much by our ear and by the feel of the snow and ice underfoot as by sight. At one point, Bowers dropped into a deep crevasse and hung there by his sledging harness out of sight until rescued with a rope." And here is Wilson's drawing of it. It's a seemingly bottomless crevasse. The ice is hundreds of feet thick. No one knows where it would end. And you see Wilson's drawing. Now that's one advantage of man-hauling. You're in a sledging harness, so if you slipped into a crevasse, you're held up by the harness. That is, unless the sledge you're pulling follows you down. And off this picture, Cherry Gerard is up at the top trying his darndest to keep the sledge from following him down after Wilson drops down to try to rescue him, which he succeeds in doing. The temperature again plunged toward minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, making their sleeping bags worthless for warmth, so that they could get into them at night. Problem with sleeping bags, just to warn you if you ever go down there, is at night when you're in your bag you sweat. And the water passes out into the sleeping bag. And then at minus 70 degrees, as soon as you get out, it freezes solid. So if you roll up your sleeping bag, you can never unroll it. So what they had to do was lay their sleeping bags out flat on their sledges and stuff them with their clothes so that they would freeze with an opening. And then the idea is at night, you pull the clothes out and you slide in. By the end of their trip, each of the 17-pound sleeping bags had accumulated over 25 pounds of ice. So the sleeping bags were 17 plus 27 or more. Cherry Gerard complained of uncontrollable shivering and recurrent nightmares whenever he tried to sleep. He wrote, "The worst job was to get into our bags. The second, or equally worse, was to lie in them for 6 hours. No one got much sleep at night. Bowers and Cherry Gerard became so exhausted they literally fell asleep while they were pulling their sledges. They would walk asleep. Cherry Gerard's jaws chattered so much that all of his teeth shattered." In his book about the expedition, Cherry Gerard described the Crozier trip as, quote, "the worst journey in the world." The return trip took 8 days, and the entire journey lasted over 5 weeks. Other members of the expedition gasped when they saw how the party appeared when they returned, and shuddered when they heard the traveler's tale. Surveying the 3 men, Scott commented, and here's what they looked like on their first cup of tea after they got back. Scott commented, "They looked more weather-worn than anyone I have ever seen. Their faces were scarred and wrinkled, their eyes dull, their hands whitened and creased from the constant exposure to cold and damp." Yet, 2 months after these guys got back, and still weakened from their ordeal, Wilson and Bowers set off with Scott for the pole. Now, these 2 extreme efforts were only the most dramatic distractions from the pole expedition's focus on reaching the pole. Whenever in residence in winter quarters, all of the officers and scientists participated in a rigorous regimen of meteorological, magnetic, and oceanographical research. with data collected on a daily and in some cases hourly basis. And just for an example, here's Wilson and Bowers taking meteorological readings in midwinter darkness, of course, from their base. The team's marine biologists regularly cut holes in the 6-foot-thick sea ice to dredge for marine specimens throughout the winter. Somebody had to cut the holes, 6 feet thick ice. A physicist studied ice and snow crystals. 2 geologists, here's one of them, and a glaciologist stationed at the winter quarters led an extended 6-man journey into the dry valleys, rugged peaks, and enormous glaciers of the Transantarctic Mountains during the expedition's first summer, then spent the winter at base not helping prepare for the polar trip. These were scientists, trained scientists. They spent it studying their collections before heading out on a similar journey during the second summer. This second journey coincided with Scott's polar trek, drawing off men and resources for efforts nothing to do with getting to the pole. It's a different direction. Further, during the first of these journeys, this group that you see here in base, they had set a series of stakes across the Farrar Glacier over on the mainland so that they could gauge how the glacier moved. But that means you've got to go back and check the measurements to see how it moved a year later. So in September of 1911, only weeks before he set out to go to the South Pole, Scott took Bertie Bowers, who was just back from that death-defying winter journey to Cape Crozier, meteorologist George Simpson, and Edgar Evans on a sledge trip over to the Transantarctic Mountains, the opposite direction as the pole, to see if those stakes had moved. Here they are setting it out with Bowers and Scott in front. That's their camp, their main base, behind them. In his diary, Scott characterized this 2-week trip in September of 1911 as a, quote, useful warm-up for the polar journey. But his harshest critic, historian Roland Huntford, later condemned it. Quote, Scott went 150 miles in a senseless direction. He would have done better to move fresh seal meat along the road to the south. Certainly, if your goal is only getting to the pole, it would have been. That's what Amundsen was doing during September. He was moving supplies south, coming back, moving supplies south. But that's not if you're understanding the trip as a scientific enterprise. The trip certainly was an ordeal. It included man-hauling sledges in minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and at one point a forced march of 35 miles, man-hauling in one 24-hour period. So therefore, Huntford's criticism has merit. Yet, Scott was thinking differently. Just 2 days before departing on this trip, after reviewing the expedition's scientific work so far, and after all but conceding that Amundsen, because he traveled so fast with dogs, would surely beat him to the pole, Amundsen wrote this in his little booth in the little bedroom in the cabin. This is him writing in his diary. He wrote, no, Scott wrote this. Scott wrote this. Thank you. Scott wrote this. It is really a satisfactory state of affairs all around. If the polar journey comes off, that means if I get down there and back safely, nothing, not even lost priority at the pole, that is, not even Amundsen beating me, can prevent this expedition, his expedition, ranking as the most important one that ever entered polar regions north or south. That's with losing the race, he said that. Science would make it so, and that science must be served. Well, scarcely a month after returning from this track, and by then 10 days behind Amundsen and leaving, Scott headed south across the Ross Ice Shelf, up the Beardmore Glacier, and over the polar plateau with teams of men, ponies, tractors, and dogs. Unlike Amundsen, who traveled light and with only those who would go the entire distance for speed, Scott planned to have the various supporting parties drop back in stages until only one group was left up on the polar plateau to man-haul a single sledge across that plateau to the pole itself. In the end, this group consisted of Scott, Bowers, Wilson, Evans, and British Army Captain Lawrence Titus Oates. Here they are sledging over the polar plateau. Of course, somebody has to take the picture, but here are 4 of them, and their one sledge. So just to wrap up, let me pick up the story as they approach the pole, just to finish it off. On January 16, less than 20 miles from the pole, they sighted debris left by the Norwegians. This told the whole story, Scott wrote. It is a terrible disappointment, and I'm very sorry for my loyal companions. Those companions, however, didn't seem very disappointed at all. They were proud of what they'd done. Bertie Bowers wrote in his diary, "It's sad that we have been forestalled by the Norwegians, but I'm glad we've done it by good British man-hauling." For Wilson, solace came in science. While the Norwegians had won the race, he wrote, "We have done what we came to do all the same, as our scientific program was made out." The British team found the small tent left by Amundsen, and here they are, the tent. Took several rounds of sight to confirm the location, and then departed a day later. And here's the 5 of them actually at the pole. There are 5 of them because you can see Bertie Bowers is pulling a little string to take the picture. You can see how beat they were already compared to that picture of the Norwegians, who looked much fresher when they were at the pole. On the return trip, the surface posed the most relentless problems, with extreme cold producing that sand-like soul that Wilson had encountered going to the Crozier trip. It was much the same day after day if you read the Sledger's diary. They're filled with the same complaints about the snow. All pull, no glide, with the sledge runners sometimes sinking so deep into the granular surface that the crossbars plowed through the snow. One expects the Antarctic to be cold even in summer, but it had actually turned colder than normal, and as it became later in the season, much, much colder than Amundsen had ever faced. Hunger stalked the polar party too, even though it traveled on full rations. Until near the journey's end, they reached their various depots with food to spare, but the prescribed amount for each meal did not supply enough calories for pulling at altitude over poor surface at low temperature. Then the fuel oil began running low due to leakage from the stores left in the depots on their way out, which meant cold pemmican rather than warm hoosh. The unrelenting, heavy sledging, low temperature, and inadequate diet inevitably weakened everyone. For Evans, the serious trouble began when he gashed his hand on the sledge runner on December 31. The wound became infected and his fingers suffered severe and prolonged frostbite. He lost 3 fingernails. By the time the polar party reached the Beardmore Glacier on its return trip, Wilson noted, "Evans' fingers discharging pus, nose very bad and looking rotten. By then, Oates' feet had reached a critical stage. Titus's toes are black," Wilson reported, "and his nose and his cheeks are dead yellow." Nevertheless, and this captures the difference between the two, in this condition, looking as they did, but even worse, they've covered the polar plateau, they're now going down that Beardmore Glacier, and then will be on the surface of the Ross Ice Shelf and have to cross that. Nevertheless, halfway down the glacier, they took time out to do geology, to study geology. Now, deep snow, let me show one of my pictures that sort of captures this. Deep snow covers, and ice covers most of the trip. On the polar plateau, you can't do any geological research. It's just a half mile of ice below you. On the Ross Ice Shelf, it's just ice. And most of the Beardmore Glacier, as you can see coming down here, this is coming down the Beardmore Glacier, is just ice covered. But on one side, Mount Buckley sticks out. And that's on one side of the Beardmore Glacier. And that's where Scott decided to swerve over and do research. Now, they, as Scott wrote in his journal, they pulled over below Mount Buckley to a moraine. Now, let's help this out. This is my picture today. This was their picture of it. Heading down the glacier, this is a picture they took across. This is what they saw and decided to swerve over to go over to the edge, a rock moraine right below this Mount Buckley. As he wrote, the moraine was obviously so interesting that I decided to camp and spend the rest of the day geologizing. we found ourselves under perpendicular cliffs of beacon sandstone, weathering rapidly, carrying variable coal seams. From the last, Wilson, with his sharp eyes, has picked out several plant impressions. That means fossils of plants. Not real plants, not living plants, but fossils. Now, this is Wilson's sketch. This is what photograph of what they saw. Wilson always sketched wherever he did research, so you could identify it. It's the only way you could do valid research. This is the last sketch he ever made. This is that same area. This is the sandstone identified. This is where he pulled the various rocks from. You can see his different marks of where he took the fossils from. Now, these impressions that Wilson spotted included some from the distinctive Paleozoic era flora known as Glossopteris, which geologists on all three British expeditions had been looking for but had not yet found. Now, this is an interesting flora because it's known in the fossil record of, it was then known and still is known in the fossil record of South America, Africa, and Australia. But evolutionists at that time were stymied about how it got to these three desperate places, South America, Africa, and Australia, unless it had first evolved on a central Antarctic continent and then moved north as the global climate cooled. Indeed, it was Darwin himself who hypothesized this before it was even known that there was an Antarctic continent. And he postulated that there must be an Antarctic continent where this had evolved and then moved north as things grew warmer. Now, by finding this fossil, Scott and his party could establish that the four southern continents were once connected, were once linked, and that could help give meaning to a failed attempt to reach the pole first. So it wasn't idle curiosity; it was a significant scientific question that got him to stop. Well, this break gave the party its last respite. They then have to head back on down the glacier and on to the Ross Ice Shelf. Evans was the first to go. After floundering down the glacier for a week from their geologizing and falling into several crevasses, he became increasingly disorientated. Wilson thought that Evans had injured his head in a fall, and by February 16th described him as, quote, sick, giddy, and unable to walk even by the sledge on skis. Evans dropped far behind the others a day later, and when they went back for them, he was on his knees with his gloves off, a wild look in his eyes. By the time they carried him back to the tent, he had slipped into a coma and soon died. Leaving the body, they proceeded on down the glacier and onto the ice shelf itself. Now, famously, Oates was the next to go. His feet kept getting worse. The cold and the lack of fuel for hot meals contributed to the problem. By the ice shelf's midpoint, he could no longer pull in harness and soon began holding the party back, which irked the soldier in him. On March 11, Scott ordered Wilson to supply everyone with a fatal dose of opium, but Oates struggled on with the others for 5 more days. Scott wrote in his diary on the 17th of March, Oates slept through the night before last, hoping not to wake, but he woke in the morning. It was blowing a blizzard. He said, I'm just going outside and maybe some time. He went out in the blizzard, and we have not seen him since. March 17 was Oates's 32nd birthday. The others marched their last on March 19. 2 days earlier, they had left everything behind except the barest essentials and, at Wilson's request, their diaries, their field notes, and the 35 pounds of rock specimens they had taken off Mount Buckley. These they carried to the end. Their final camp stood only 11 miles shy of a massive depot stocked with special treats, where a relief party had waited until the 10th. Scott's right foot had given out, and their fuel was nearly gone, but they retained some hope of getting through. They knew their approximate location. Then a blizzard struck. It lasted at least 8 days, or so Scott's diary states. By then, they had eaten all of their remaining food and used all their fuel. Some historians have suggested that the blizzard must have ended earlier, but that either Wilson and Bowers would not leave Scott, whose foot had given out, or that Scott held them back. In any event, they died together, with Wilson and Bowers in an attitude of sleep, and Scott between them, his sleeping bag half open and an arm flung across Wilson. The following spring, a search party found them frozen in this position, along with their notes, diaries, and, of course, the geological specimens. Here they are in their tent during their polar journey. Lots of us know something about Amundsen, Scott, and their expeditions to the South Pole. It's an epic tale that has become part of our common knowledge. As with much of our common knowledge, however, it is somewhat mythologized. From my experience, here's what I found most people think. Amundsen and his Norwegian team arrived at the pole first after an amazing dash by dog sled. Scott's group reached it 5 weeks later, exhausted from having man-hauled their sledges much of the way. Scott, for some reason few people seem to understand, wanted men to pull and did not want dogs to suffer. Because the two teams reached the pole so close together, people naturally view it as a race, some sort of an exotic international Olympiad. Amundsen then rushes back to his base in a stunning exhibition of Scandinavian efficiency. Disappointed in defeat, Scott's men trudge north in worsening weather on waning supplies, succumbing in a snowstorm only miles from their main supply depot. Over time and countless tellings of the story, Amundsen becomes a model of modern organization. Not necessarily loved, but certainly respected, while Scott seems a tragic and heroic Victorian blunderer, derided by some for his poor planning and idolized by others for his perseverance in the face of death. Well, the common knowledge, I say, is about right on Amundsen, but it's sorely deficient on Scott. Of the two expeditions, Scott was actually the more modern in its conception and a marvel of planning, if not execution. With 35 men wintering in the Antarctic compared to Amundsen's 9, Scott led a complex and multifaceted scientific expedition while Amundsen staked everything on the pole. Further, the common knowledge ignores that Scott's final expedition was the third in a series of British Antarctic expeditions that built directly on a much longer history of Royal Navy voyages of scientific exploration and discovery in the Southern Ocean, dating back to the days of James Cook and James Clark Ross. Initially a secondary and unspoken ambition of these efforts, being the first to the South Pole gradually became a British obsession, but one only to be achieved in the course of conducting a scientific research and detailed mapping. Scott captures that all by what he wrote about his final expedition just before he left. He wrote, "Doubtless there are those who will criticize our provision for scientific research in view of the expedition's published objective of reaching the South Pole. But I believe that the more intelligent section of the community will heartily approve of the endeavor to achieve the greatest possible scientific harvest which the circumstances permit. The British explorers and their sponsors would never admit to being engaged in a mere dash to the pole. Amundsen had no such inhibitions. He won the race, at least in part because Scott was handicapped by scientific aims. But in the course of losing that race, researchers on the British expedition helped to open an unknown continent for science." Thank you. Do we have time for some questions? Is that allowed?
Let me first question. So the two that died last with Scott,
Bowers and Wilson.
yeah, were they? I mean, because they'd been on the earlier expedition and been in terrible shape when they got back. Why were they chosen for Scott in that to even go to the pole? I mean, was their experience thought to be of value to Scott in getting to the pole?
That's a good question. Mixed reasons. The reason why Bowers and Cherry Gerard were picked to go with, the reason why Bowers was picked to go with Wilson on the winter journey was because he was viewed as the best of the sledgers. and therefore Scott viewed him as important for his reaching the pole. Wilson had been with Scott when he tried to reach the pole on his first expedition. Shackleton, Wilson, and Scott went on the attempt to reach the pole. It failed miserably, but the first expedition, the Discovery expedition, Wilson was an old hand. Wilson was also a scientist and thought that there could be some important research on the way. He was the only scientist on the group going down. Typically, what you had was all these scientists went along without Scott. They all went off and did their own thing. Scott was not a scientist. He was a naval captain. He was going to make his own little trip, his glory trip down to pole, bag a pole, while the scientists were off doing work. But he wanted Wilson to go with him because he was a friend, he was dependable, he was very hardworking. And their winter sledging trip, he viewed it as showing their endurance. Now, Sherry Gerard was supposed to go with them, but he was broken by the trip and never recovered, never really mentally recovered from the winter journey, and therefore he was dropped off. He didn't go on the polar journey. But the other two had seemed to survive and were bouncing back somewhat. They also had added experience. I didn't even tell one of the worst things about this poor the winter journey is the only reason Wilson insisted on going on it to study the penguins. Scott wanted to have something of value come from it, so he said, we're going to test proper food for endurance in the winter that I can then use on my polar journey. So there were three things these people ate on these expeditions. They ate this pemmican, which is sort of a dried meat. They eat biscuits for carbohydrates, and they eat butter for fat. They take butter along. On the winter journey, they were directed, each of them could only eat one of the things to see which of the best. So one person was assigned a pound of butter a day. Another one, these biscuits, and another one, nothing but pemmican, dried meat, to see which was the better for endurance. And that on the way out, they kept records. Eating nothing but butter is tough on a variety of reasons. But that's how they were using this. So they did view that these men were experienced for it. They were also trusted men, but they were physically beaten. They hadn't recovered from the trip. So they were very much weakened. But of course, they are the two that last the longest. Evans, and for entirely other reasons, Evans and Oates go first. Good question, though. Yeah.
Fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about the clothes? There's a picture of you in your book with your big down thing. Everybody wears thick down clothes. And I look at these and the Shackleton pictures, and I don't know what they're wearing, but it looks very flimsy. Didn't they have down?
No, they didn't. But it's a good question. These trips, these were British trips. And they had to get their funds from someplace. The British government had paid for half of the cost of the Discovery, the first expedition, and ultimately contributed some to this one. The Royal Society put up money and the Royal Geographic Society put up money because these were scientific endeavors. But most of the money they had to raise. And one of the ways they raised money was selling their story. And so Scott sold his story in advance for a book and sold his newspaper rights in every country, and he sold the magazine rights. But they also had everything sponsored. So every dog was sponsored, every pony was sponsored, the sleeping bags were sponsored. You know, school children would raise money, or investors would. Their food, they had to eat Quaker oats because Quaker oats provided the oats, and then they had to put pictures. They were Shackleton eats his Quaker oats when he's at the pole, and these would appear in ads. Well, for clothing, Burberry was their sponsor. So they had to wear Burberry's clothes, which were gabardine. It was a new development. So they had gabardine clothes that Burberry had made, and of course there were ads running in the London Times and everything else about our polar explorers are down there wearing Burberry. And so that's how they got their clothes. Now, actually, they would not have worked except for the fact that they were man-hauling. Because they were pulling their own sledges, they didn't have problems with their clothes. With the amount of sweating you do and the work you do pulling your sledges, the gabardine actually worked quite well. Amundson's men would have died with gabardine. They used these Arctic furs. And so that's where they got their clothes. The clothes were sponsored, and they were advertised as wearing Burberry gabardine. So that's what they wore.
And where did down come from? Down clothes then?
None of these people wore down. They wore fur. Down came later because even their sleeping bags weren't down. They had reindeer skin sleeping bags, reindeer fur and reindeer skin. I don't know exactly where, but down it's it's obviously goose down. They had pillows made of that, but they were wearing gabardine. Yes.
I was puzzled by that second picture you had, I think, with Amundsen's tan at the pole.
Yes.
Could you put that up again?
Sure. Happily. Yeah.
Okay, but the second picture, at the beginning of the presentation, there was another picture of the tan at the pole.
Yeah.
And it looked like the sun in the background.
Oh yeah.
But in the summer, that sun shouldn't be on the horizon. It looks like it's at the horizon. And at the summer, it should be 23.5 degrees up.
It should just
Yes,
rotate
circle
around.
at 23.5
It
degrees.
circles around.
And that doesn't
Yes.
look, is that 23.5? It looks like it's on the horizon.
I think it depends on where you're taking it from, but you're right. It circles. I've been there at that time, and it just circles straight around.
And that just
right
looks
around
so
it.
low, and that's why I wondered whether that was the sun.
Well, it may be a speck on it. It may instead be a speck on it. It may be the angle they're taking it at because
Look at their shadows.
yeah. Look at the shadows. You're right. Good point.
Where can you?
Because they're
I don't see the shadow.
They're definitely taking the picture. These are good photographers. You're going to have the sun this way so that the sun is brightening. It'd be dark if they wouldn't get a good picture. So the sun's obviously on this side of
so
them.
what is
And
that?
see, here's a shadow. It's probably just a chip.
Oh,
'cause
that's
I don't
just-
think, it could be. It could be the opposite side of the what do they call them? Sundog. It could be the opposite side of a sundog. If you've ever been down there, it's the equivalent of a rainbow. When you have blowing snow, you get this effect. It's absolutely magnificent. Around the sun, there is a circle.
Sort of a halo effect.
Well, it's more than that.
Oh.
But it's this incredible thing, and then there's a double level. It's like a rainbow, and then there are dots coming around, and on a good day, they'll go all the way around.
Oh,
So
and
it
that
could
and
be
that
one
could
of the, it
and that
one of
could
the
be close to
sundog-
the.
sundog dots.
Oh, so that could be close to the horizon.
Because
then.
that would be going all the way around. And
Close-
they'd be going up. It follows all the directions. Look up sundogs sometime when they bring Wikipedia back up.
Okay.
Um,
how do you spell that? Sundogs?
Sundogs. They're beautiful. They're absolutely stunning. If I had my camera here, I'd show you some pictures I took of them. Could be the other side, but it's a good question. But no, the sun would have been over here. I've never thought about that before. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for your speech. It's pretty enlightening. It seems there's a lot of English hubris that led to the comparison between the Norwegians and the English. The Norwegians definitely went and adapted, figuring out this is how we need to survive there and not going with what we came with. And the English came down with the mindset of, we are English. We do it the English way. Now, appropriately, you're standing in the SETI headquarters, and there's an image of Mars behind you. Translating this into a future that is possible, we have humans in the recent near term exploring that planet, not doing it the same way that we've done it with landers and rovers. Now we have some way that we've kind of set that this country does exploration, similar to perhaps the English way. How do you see the lessons learned from this extrapolating to extraplanetary exploration?
That's truly a wonderful question. A little bit of anecdote just to lead into it. The reason why I went into history of science was because as a kid, I grew up with space exploration, and I came from not far from where John Glenn lived and Neil Armstrong in Ohio, and I dreamed of going to space. And I thought about it, and I said, I could never make it. I could never be like John Glenn. I could never be a great pilot. How can I get it? And I figured, eventually they're going to, I never thought we'd give up after we got to the moon. I thought we'd keep going. I thought we'd be in Mars by now. By the time long by now, I figured we'd be Mars by the year 2000. And I figured eventually they'll want to take historians along. And if I study and get a PhD in the history of science, I have a chance. And then that was my reason of going into history of science. And then they stopped the space program, and I had to, or virtually, they stopped all their activities. They certainly stopped taking people like school teachers along and historians. And so I thought I'd be up there by now. And then I retooled and figured, well, what's the best I can do? Well, I can write a book about Antarctica and research Antarctica, and then the NSF will send me down to Antarctica. And so I got to go down for 3 months and live in and I get to go back and do research in Antarctica and go with all the scientists out there. I was hoping to be in Mars. So yeah, I think we do. So I'm very sensitive to those issues, and I do think we need to learn. I think we learn the flexibility. Now, you certainly, but remember, Amundsen did no science. He didn't even plot. He didn't even make proper mapping. He went over an unknown road to the pole, and he described in passing, he passed these mountains, and he named them for the Norwegian king and things like that. But nobody knows still which mountains he was talking about because he didn't map them. He didn't do proper mapping. The British, in contrast, came back with perfect maps. I mean, they would triangulate everything. You saw the Australian Denenbaum, that picture with his plane table. That's what he was doing with his plane table, plotting where the mountains were. So, yeah, you have to learn. I think you can learn from both parts. I mean, if you're properly going to record what you have there, it's the British that ended up bringing back, and the German, there was a German, if you read the book, there's a German, there's a French, there's some other expeditions too, and I talk about them in the book. I don't just talk about this one. I just talk about this one because of the time, this is the anniversary. But they came back with a complete basic understanding of Antarctica, virtually what we knew today. And those scientists who came back kept all the study of, because then the war came, World War I, and then the interwar period, and then World War II, and we didn't go back. But these scientists who scattered around and were in universities all over the English-speaking world continued to hold conferences, hold meetings. Our knowledge of Antarctica was based on this, and they were around to launch the 50s when they went back. It was people like Priestley, who became head of the University of Melbourne. He was the vice chancellor, which is the top post there. Or Denenbaum, who was back at Scott Polar and founded Scott Polar in England. Or Mawson, who was on Shackleton's expedition, who led the Australians back. And they laid all that foundation. So we do have to go, if we want to build on what we do, we have to go with enough science and enough rigor to actually do it that way. But yes, Amundsen shows that by adapting, amazingly these other men survived, and it was only Scott's team that died. But yeah, I think we should think about what we can draw from that. Indeed, when they study what it might be like on the moon or Mars, where they go to study that is the dry valleys. Because I've been with the scientists in the dry valleys who were doing just that. Because it's the closest thing we have to what might be like on another planet. So yeah, we have to draw from that knowledge. There's a lot to be drawn from these experiences. And I think it does involve the flexibility of Amundsen, the strengths at Amundsen. What Shackleton brought was a sense of humor, and everybody loved being with Shackleton. And he attracted the best scientists. So his Nimrod expedition attracted 50-year-old Royal Society geologists because they wanted to be with Shackleton. Nobody liked being with Scott. He was a tough bird. They went with him because they were committed to science, but then they tried to stay away as far as possible and do their own science because he was because of his personality. We can draw. We should learn from what they went through because they went through the closest thing that we went through to what we're trying to do. So yeah, I would think those would be some. You may have some other ideas.
That begs the question. I mean, which type of leader is the right one?
Well, I'll tell you, if I wanted to get to the pole and back and just have done it, I would go with Amundsen. If I wanted to have fun in the process, still survive, come back with some wonderful, wonderful stories, and have a team of people who were doing really meaningful work, I'd go with Shackleton. I don't think I'd go with Scott.
Question over here.
Yes.
I think actually the appropriate analogy, if you want to use a current one for the English is Chris McCandless, who died up in Alaska. And before, I had no interest initially in the Antarctic until a friend of mine started doing research down there, and I joined them. I think that pretty much all of the commentary about the mistakes that Scott did up to that point in time, I think were basically essentially all survivable. Most people who do these analyses have never done an expedition. I think the critical problem that basically doomed Scott didn't happen until the last cache. See, they had done all their planning with 4-man groups, and Scott's inability to make a decision as to who the 4 to go to the pole would be, the fact that it's, well, we'll stretch with the 5th person. They only had 4 pairs of skis.
Right.
The 5th man had to walk.
Post hole is
Post hole is particular, although not bad enough to require snowshoes, as you probably know, the snowshoe joke in the Antarctic.
Well, he didn't have snowshoes anyway. So.
Well, skis are far more efficient in that kind of situation. Yeah. And so anyways, the photos with them wearing skis, because they were all poor skiers, that was done solely for publicity's sake. And the fact that they had to stretch 25% for every cache, for whoever the 5th man was. One of the things that didn't happen until the 1970s, when computers were starting to be used for expedition planning, was the fact that these are quadratic cost functions. So your mistake gets compounded over time. And I think that's, of all of the things that I have heard from the literature and the like, I think Scott's inability to make that decision to send somebody back. Cherry Gerard, for instance, he did kind of want to go to the pole. He certainly was out of shape. I also read Worst Journey in the World as well too, and it made an impression on a lot of the people I know who've gone down there as well. But that he couldn't do that. I mean, Scott, when you didn't mention in terms of the Nimrod expedition, one of the things that Shackleton did for him actually for Scott was they also had a problem guy. Shackleton punched the guy in the face 3 times. This one particular guy they couldn't get rid of on the Nimrod expedition. He was Scott's strongman on the first expedition down there, and it was just simply let's just simply take the guy aside and explain to him. But he knew what had to be done, and that's why Endurance is Lansing's Endurance is the book everybody's told to read before you go down there. But I mean, all these men have fantastic stories. One other thing too, by the way, Wilson's drawings. Wilson also has watercolors, and I picked up a set of those when I visited the Scott Center in Cambridge as well too. I highly recommend those because they're very beautiful watercolors as well.
Yeah. The one thing I'd comment on that, and I don't disagree with anything you said. I think Scott not making it was a series of but-fors. It wasn't any one thing. I think he would have made it, even with all of his poor choices, if the weather hadn't turned cold. I think he had bad luck too. But he did make poor choices, and it wasn't only that he took 5 people. That was certainly one of the bad choices, that he took 5 instead of 4 the last time, even though they planned for 4. But also, the whole trip had been planned. He had basically almost invented the tractor to carry. Amundsen, Shackleton had taken a car down because it was sponsored by the Pierce Aero Company, and he had to take it down and drive it, and then they advertised it. But Scott was smart enough to think of tractor, put tractor belts on it. So his idea was, we're going to have tractors, we're going to have ponies, which of course was Shackleton's idea. Shackleton had taken ponies. Ponies are not the brightest idea because they too put all their weight and they sink through the ice, so they have to wear snowshoes. They also, the way they sweat through their bodies, so they freeze, where dogs don't do that. But the idea of Scott was going to have tractors, and he was going to have ponies, and he was going to have dogs, and they would each, the tractors would make it part of the way, ponies would make it a little further. Each would go as far as they want and then cache their supplies, and then the ponies would make it a little further, and they'd cache, and then the dogs would make it a little further, and then this 4-person band would go through. Well, the summer before, in a tragic accident, Scott, during using the ponies to put down early supply depots, had lost half the ponies because they got caught on a piece of field ice and the killer whales came and knocked them off and ate them. And he didn't change the plan. The plan was relying on the full complement of ponies. The great advantage of ponies is not only do you cache their supplies, but then you kill them and you eat them. British don't have any problem eating ponies. They don't like to eat dogs. So they lost half of their meat and they lost half of their pulling support, and yet he didn't change other parts of the plan. So I think the ponies were as big a mistake that was a matter of choice as taking 5 men, and I could rattle off some other mistakes Scott made. I still think that he would have made it, despite all those mistakes, if it hadn't turned incredibly and unseasonably cold, and they've worked out the temperatures he faced. So you add that, and of course he didn't know that the fuel would leak. He didn't know that the British seals would crack at the temperature. The Norwegian seals on their fuel didn't crack, but he also lost his fuel for getting warm. So it was it was mistakes, it was bad luck, and it was, in a way, a trip ironically planned for safety. He didn't know he was going to be in a race. He never knew Amundsen was going when he planned his trip. He thought he was the only person in the field. Amundsen never told anyone he was going south. He was going to be going to the North Pole. It was only after he was sailing he changed his direction. So Scott had planned for safety a slow march on the pole and back. Amundsen knew he was in a race and planned for speed. Scott made no change. Once one of his scientific parties bumped into Amundsen, and he knew the fall before, once he knew Amundsen was in the race, he did not, probably he couldn't have, but he wasn't nimble enough to change his strategy. So for a whole variety of reasons, they combine, and it leads to this, this result. Scott had been on death-defying trips before, like his across the polar plateau on the Discovery expedition. He always barely survives. Now, and that, I'll add one other observation, is I am convinced from all looking at everything, Amundsen planned for safety. Every one of Scott's trips, not just this one, every time he went out, it was a death-defying ordeal. When he went with Wilson and Shackleton on the Discovery south, or when he went up over the polar plateau on that expedition, every trip out was death-defying. He planned everything to be on the razor's edge, but he was getting his money and achieving his goal by writing up the story. And only he knew what sold. He had read Livingston. David Livingstone had done the same thing. He had read John Franklin. Franklin had done the same thing, the man who ate his boots on the first trip and then died on the second with Erebus and Terror. There was a history of British writing adventure travel. Burton and Speakes did it too. You can rattle off the names. They're all pushed themselves to the verge of death and then just pull themselves out. It's a way they wrote. Scott's adventures had to be that way to sell and to create his name. So I think he was always wanted to push himself to the edge because that's what's old. Amundsen wasn't in that tradition. Neither his Northwest Passage book nor his South Pole book. They both read like, anybody could do this. I mean, this is just, anybody could do this. And he tries to make it sound even easier than it was by the way they wrote it. So you're in a different tradition. So I thought Scott intentionally also liked to put himself on the edge and just pull things out. So I throw out a lot, there are a lot of theories, whatever, we know the end result. And historians have dabbled in all those explanations. Do we have time for any more? One last question. The other corner.
Maybe this is a quick one too. Since it's not my field, I'm curious about when they found Scott's expedition and they had all the scientific stuff and read the diaries, what happened to the publishing Wilson's research and how was it received at the time?
Oh, yeah, good question. Well, Wilson had made his name scientifically on the earlier expedition, the Discovery expedition, where they found the penguins and wrote up the first monograph on the emperor penguins that became really world famous. I mean, it fascinated everyone, the story of the penguins. He then did research on grouse in England, which was very important research. He was a big name. His pictures were very popular. Now, all the other scientists had gone off and done their own material. So Denenbaum came back with his story. Priestley came. They'd done all that research. Scott had, of course, already sold his rights to his book. He had already sold the newspaper rights in America and in England and in France and everywhere else. He'd already sold his magazine rights separately. All these have been sold. It's known from years of experience, going back to David Livingstone and beyond, 100 years of experience with selling these sorts of things, that you have a very short window when you get back for publication, because you're a big name right away. Well, you have to catch the wave to sell, to be a bestseller. So it has to be written by the time you get back. So you have to be writing it while you're there. You've sold the newspaper rights. What they all did, Amundsen did this, they all did this. You come back, you don't sail right into port. You sail off to a secret location and in disguise go in and telegraph your report to whoever you sold it to, the New York Times, the London Times, the Paris Match, wherever you sold it. You telegraph it and then you sail in. Because once the reporters hit you, you've lost the scoop. So Scott had been writing his book. That's why we have it. He'd been writing his book the whole time he was down there, such as the picture I showed him writing. He was constantly writing his book. So his book was basically done. Now, all the story before he'd gone to the pole, he'd already finished, and that was all in manuscript form in the cabin. While he was going down to the pole and back, every night he'd write the next part of the book. And then when he was dying in the tent, he spent those 8 days finishing his book. Because that was the life support for his son and his wife. And so when the recovery team found them, their main job, of course, they'd been told, come out and get us and get the book. And so when they got there, the book, it was literally frozen into Scott's arm. They had to break his arm to get the manuscript out. That is his last journey. So it was a complete story. Now, Wilson wasn't doing that. Wilson hadn't sold his rights. I mean, he couldn't. All the men, when they joined the thing, they had all agreed that they would not write the story of their trip because that would compete with Scott. So they'd all agreed not to write the story. They could do their scientific research. So Wilson's field notes were there. But no, they recognized, he'd written right in there, by the way, when you come and get this, on the sledge, I think that's Glossopteris. I'm not a paleontologist. I'm a penguin person. But I think that's what we're looking for. And so they found it, and it was. And so, yes, it was an important story because it was the linchpin to prove what other evidence was already showing about the connection of the continents. They realized the importance, and it was a big story of what the rocks were. But you ask about, you thought it'd be a short, with me, no questions, a short answer. But it's an interesting story, and that's how we have Scott's story finished to the end. Well, virtually to the end. So we have his book of Scott's last journey, which was then published. So that's how they finished off the story, and he wrote such a beautiful closing epistle about the hardiness of those stories he wrote at the very end. This journey shows the hardiness of British to endeavor and things like that. Those were all his fully quotes writing from the last 8 days. And he also wrote letters to his wife. They all wrote letters to their spouses and things like that.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, Ed. We have a special SETI mug as a memorial of your talk.
Well, thank you.
And please join me in thanking Ed for his great talk.
Thank you very much. I guess there are some books over there. So.
Yeah, so we have the books.